Thanks for joining us today for the final webinar in our Find Your Cloud series. We've shared in previous webinars, but ERP Suites provides a range of services from JDE consulting and managed services through cloud services and digital transformation project work. And we're proud to have supported over 300 companies across a wide range of industries over the last 15 years. And many of those are customers that we hosted in our private cloud. And there's no better people to tell you about those experiences than today's speakers, Frank Jordan, Paul Shearer, and once again, joining them is Josh Tibbs. We'll cover performance and resilience again today so you can easily evaluate the benefits of private cloud versus public cloud. So let's get started with fast facts. Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. So first, just a little bit of an introduction to the ERP Suites Private Cloud. We have two primary data centers delivering our private cloud service, and those have been running constantly for 15 plus years now. It's our most popular hosting option for our JDE customers that we work with, and we can deliver Linux, Windows, OS 400. That last one is something that most of the public clouds cannot do. And in our data centers, we work with top tier vendors. Those are our strategic vendors. You see their names up here on the slide, and we're always looking for next gen tech to try to deliver the best hosting experience for our customers.
So let's talk a little bit about why JD Edwards makes sense in a lot of cases for private cloud. And Josh, I love the example that you're going to get into in the next slide, pets versus cattle. Can you talk about what this means, what the distinction is, and why this is applicable to JD Edwards?
Yeah, sure can. Thanks, Paul. I love this analogy. So one of the things that sets our private cloud apart from the public cloud offerings is our access and insight into the entire technology stack that runs the applications. At the public cloud providers, give up a little bit of that access in exchange for the commoditization of the platform that gives you the scalability and the low cost. And that works. It's great. Don't get me wrong. But on a private cloud, we're able to see a little bit more below the surface and kind of deliver a more curated approach almost to running certain app workloads like enterprise apps. So you can kind of think about the public clouds as a cost-effective and scalable way to house your cattle, so to speak, and our private cloud, it's a great way to get sort of the best attention and caring for your favorite pets, if that makes sense.
Got it. So it seems like each approach is geared towards different types of workloads. Frank, can you maybe help us understand what types of applications work really well for public cloud and what others would be possibly more suited for private?
Sure. The public cloud initially. So of course, Amazon's, as they call it, the 800-pound gorilla, but they were optimized initially to deliver more of the modern app architectures, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, but that leverages microservices. And a lot of that had soft dependencies for the user application logic layers and database. So from a traditional enterprise application, though, like JD Edwards, that tended to have more hard dependencies where the session state between these various architecture tiers has to be maintained, or you tend to lose the transaction or it gets rolled back. So, again, the ones that we've talked about as public cloud, they support both types of applications. They tend to assume, though, that you're using a modern application in regards to the architecture. And that's one of the reasons they tend to look at the various servers and services as cattle. If one dies or has an issue, they assume you're just going to restart, the session or the application if an outage or some type of event occurs. In our ERP Suites Private Cloud, though, we kind of favor the traditional enterprise applications, and we've designed our architectures to specifically support applications such as JD Edwards.
It's interesting, Frank. when you were talking about that, made me think of a recent example we had with one of our customers that's running on public cloud today. And they're running kind of database as a service on a cloud that everybody's going to be familiar with. And the Oracle database was running on one node, and in another availability zone, there was, you know, the standby database. And we had a failure, and I think it took 10 minutes for it to come back up. And, you know, we were all very hot and excited about this. You know, this database just went down. What's going on? We need root cause analysis. We need to know what you're going to do to keep this from happening again. And the cloud vendor's response was basically like, you know, that's cattle. You know, it died on that one server, and that's fine. So we started it up on this other server. No big deal. But, you know, like you were saying, Frank, obviously for JD Edwards, that really is a big deal. Hey, Josh, could you maybe talk a little bit more about how ERP Suites Private Cloud is really tailor suited for a lot of these enterprise workloads?
Yeah, Paul. So the ERP Suites Private Cloud, it has some features that allow us to deliver those enterprise applications a little better in many ways. So there are things like VM mobility, which in the example that you just mentioned would have been very helpful, right? They had a failure and a restart, whereas we can take virtual machines and migrate those. Whether it's for maintenance reasons, capacity reasons, or even a proactive failure, right? We have an underlying hardware event that we're already seeing indicative signs of. We can go ahead and get out in front of that. We just don't simply can the instance and restart it somewhere else. So that helps, kind of preserves that session state. You know, that Frank, I think, sort of alluded to, and ultimately helps the application availability. And most of the public clouds don't have that kind of capability, or at least they don't do it that dynamically. And I think that's one of the things that sort of sets our private cloud apart from the public cloud offerings. So, Frank, what do you think about that in the context of JD Edwards?
Oh, really? You know, the IBMI or the AS400, it's the ultimate pet. You basically have all the soft and hard dependencies rolled into a single machine, and they build those hardware redundancies right into the IBMI. So to give you, again, one of the things we've alluded to, most of the public cloud vendors, they don't support IBMI or the AS400. You know, ERP Suites, though, we have multiple IBMI servers. We have dedicated staff with decades of experience. You know, and JD Edwards itself was based on the World Software platform. You know, they had migration and coexistence and all those type of things. So it still runs very well on IBMI. And then, you know, a large number of companies have legacy code, such as RPG and CL scripts, where they've got significant investment for that.
It really is kind of crazy, Frank, after all these years, what proportion of the JD Edwards customer base is not just running on IBMI, but still kind of fanatical about it. It is a very, very popular platform. And like you said, very, very resilient.
Right. I mean, many companies, you know, they've got significant investments in that. And it's not just JD Edwards that they've done that. They could have literally hours or thousands of hours, and also in dollars, custom code, third-party applications, and so forth. So, you know, we find that outsourcing can, you know, ease some of those concerns if, let's say, some of their staff are retiring, or they, you know, want to invest, don't want to play the data center game anymore. We specialize in those various infrastructure areas.
So for customers, Frank, why would they not just want to kind of re-platform off of IBMI and maybe just do the whole thing as x86?
Yeah, that's a real good example, Paul. You think about it, JD Edwards is based, you know, the CNC architecture allows you to go to mobile platforms. which works really well. But as I kind of had talked a little bit about, you still have a lot of those third-party applications that some of them might be, let's use Mapix or some EDI software, or even COBOL programs. The third-party applications might not have an equivalent in some of the other platforms, or you might have to actually do custom code. And a number of companies would have, command line or RPG based interfaces. They could literally be still running a number that a large portion of our customers do still have that are running the 400, their own custom applications and code. So, the cost to take all that intellectual property that they put together over time, to be able to get an outage window or to go to their management and say, well, it's going to be, several man days or man weeks of effort to redo this, that can be a big challenge. So again, it's pretty significant from a cost and effort perspective.
I had a customer last year that I was working with that they were interested in getting off of that platform. So we went through and we did the analysis. And I think on the RPG side alone, it was going to be like $5 million of professional services just to switch platforms. So the CIO that I was talking with was laughing about how he thought that conversation would go with his CFO when he was going to try to tell him that, hey, we're not going to change anything at all in terms of the end user experience. We're not going to add any new business value, but I want you to spend $5 million and we'll be on a different platform at the end of the day. He just wasn't willing to have that conversation.
Yeah, neither would I.
Hey, so let's talk about a couple common misconceptions that often come up related to private cloud. Josh, can you share some of those with us?
Yeah, sure can, Paul. Thank you. One of the big ones that we keep running into is cost, right? We consistently find that the run cost on our private cloud are comparable to the public cloud options. A lot of folks come to us with a cost-saving effort and as a strategy to move to the public cloud, and that's all fine. We're happy to work through that. We just often find out that the pricing really isn't that different. And with our allocation pricing model, we can deliver usually a more consistent cost per month with lower variability. And I think a lot of folks, particularly on the financial side, really appreciate that. We don't have things like the egress charges that can hit you when you least expect it. And we can talk about more about storage performance later, but just kind of another example is where we can help save is ability to scale certain aspects independently. So public cloud, for example, you may need to buy up on instance types to hit a storage performance number, and you're overspending compute just to get the storage that you need. And I think we'll show you in a little bit how we don't have those same kinds of constraints on our private cloud, why it can make it a little bit more affordable or right-sized for these kinds of workloads.
So Josh, that example you were just talking about before where you have to go up the instance type, would that be like a scenario, and I know we'll talk about performance a little bit later, but like where Frank wants that extreme amount of IO, and maybe he doesn't need so much RAM, so much CPU, but he's got to have that huge amount of network bandwidth, but you end up having to overbuy on the other two in order to get just that one thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about, and we see that we see that not infrequently.
So basically, we don't want to be like the traditional cable providers where all I want to do is get that one channel, but now I have to buy the package of 20 others.
Yeah, that is a great analogy. So
what about scaling, Josh? This one comes up a lot where these public cloud providers are spending, well, in some cases like billions of dollars a year on CapEx. So is this something a customer should be concerned with, hosting their systems with us if they need to scale?
Yeah, for sure. It absolutely does come up. And I'll let you in on a little secret here. The ERP Suites Private Cloud is not as big as Amazon's AWS or Microsoft Azure or Oracle OCI. That's all true. But what I think we can bring is an architecture that allows our offering to scale up and scale out to accommodate the needs of the customer. So we do have scale built into the architecture. But most importantly, though, I think is that our private cloud has more granular sizing of the workloads. I know we keep touching on this a little bit, but in public clouds, you choose that instance size within a family that has certain characteristics, and like we said, that can mean oversizing one thing to get the right size and the other thing. We can scale all of those things separately. And we can even adjust things like CPU NUMA architectures to performance to database instances for optimum performance. And those are just some of the kinds of things that you can't do in public cloud, or you really have a lot of constraints about. So we built the cloud, our private cloud, that way for these kinds of workloads specifically, to have those knobs that we take care of for you, but we have the ability to do it. And we've been involving and improving on that, and it's been running nonstop for years now. So we might not have the biggest scale overall, but I think we have the right scale that our customers need for the workloads they run, and we kind of have it at every level of the stack.
And you touched on it briefly about kind of the CPU scaling and having to do some of the stuff in tandem, but that could have license implications too, couldn't it? So maybe you needed that extra bandwidth, but now you've got these extra CPUs. Does that create financial liability
Oh,
for customers?
yeah, absolutely right. And you know, there are certain core core software that we have to look at that on, and every customer will almost always have additional software, third-party software that they're bringing in, and oftentimes there is a processor count situation that they have to deal with in that. And yeah, when your back is against the wall and you need to turn up your storage performance a little bit, but you have to take twice as many CPUs to get there, all of a sudden you have to pay your software vendor twice as much um, for the licensing when you really didn't need that compute in the first place. So they really get you kind of every which way that and in those kind of situations, and we try to help you avoid that again by having that granularity at several layers.
Well, speaking of how that granularity can benefit us for JD Edwards, Frank, can you talk a little bit about what the performance characteristics are like for JD Edwards and what things on private cloud should we be concerned with?
Well, we've actually spoken about this, in the other talks as well, about JDE bottlenecks. And again, usually it's the speed of the database server or the single core clock speeds on the enterprise servers.
So are these all the same concerns then with private cloud?
Basically, yes. I mean, the performance characteristics of JDE are the same across those platforms. It's just, how the platform delivers.
Okay, so let's talk about the database then. What exactly on the database do we need to be concerned with to get that optimal performance?
Yeah, well, remember again, the two main things are, the amount of RAM and the speed of the storage.
So what about the speed of the CPUs on the database server?
Like I said, in most cases, it really doesn't matter.
So what I'm hearing is I want as much RAM as possible with as few CPU cores, kind of like what Josh and I were talking about before, because we don't want to pay Oracle or we don't want to pay Microsoft the additional licensing for those CPUs if we don't need them.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, that sounds pretty cool. So Josh, Frank was mentioning the speed of the storage on the database servers. Any thoughts there, specifically around private cloud and how we go about this?
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. So our private cloud, first of all, we use some very highly scalable hardware, some very, very high scale limits in it, right? I mentioned some of that scale up, scale out capability that we've built into the architecture. So our Cisco UCS and IBM I server technology allows us to deliver on RAM, no problem. And then on the storage side, we have all flash storage available from Pure and IBM on those platforms. Solves most of the storage needs that we have. In fact, our standard storage is all flash. So these enterprise databases run extremely well on our private cloud.
So no spinning disk.
No spinning disk.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. Early in my career, I think I spent probably 10 years of my life simply moving customers from one SAN to another, chasing performance. Most of that tied back to just kind of the physical limitations of, those spinning 10,000K, 15K disks that were out there. So I'm pretty excited to hear about this stuff. So I know with ERP Suites, we've obviously got lots of infrastructure monitoring tools and everything, but that's basically table stakes. Frank, can you talk about some of the things that we do to actually look at this from kind of an end user perspective, and specifically a JD Edwards end user? What options, what tools do we have there?
Yeah, definitely. Monitoring the JD Edwards application is very important. One of the products we do have is called ERP Suites Clarity, and it gives some performance monitoring and management features. We've used it, internally for our own hosted customers in the private cloud for many, many years. And, it provides us a historical and near-time information on the JD Edwards configuration. And the nice thing about it is we've used this solution for our private cloud customers, like I just mentioned, but we also use it in the public cloud and even for some of our on-premise customers. So, in addition to that, there's other tools that Enterprise One does have, such as Server Manager, and there's call object stats, usage tracking, the various logs, submitted jobs, and so forth that you can look at. But those are normally displaying minutes to hours, of information, and it's kind of after the fact. It doesn't really provide the user desktop experience. Oracle does have some products, their Oracle Enterprise Manager or OEM and Real User Experience Insights, RUI, but they tend to be costly for small to mid-market JD Edwards customers. So what we did in our Clarity product is we added user analytics that records, the actual end user web response for the network and their server times. That allows us to see the E1 applications that they're using along with the response time at that desktop browser. By doing that, it also allows us to give operating system and browser information to see what's in use.
So Frank, would it be kind of fair to summarize that as saying, instead of using infrastructure metrics as a gross representation of the end user experience, we're actually using the end user experience to represent the end user experience?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that is some pretty cool stuff. Thank you for sharing that. So we just talked about performance. Let's move on to resiliency. So I know that these days this is something front and center in everyone's mind. Josh, what can you tell us about resiliency on private cloud?
Yeah, so let's pull back a little bit first and talk about that at a kind of a high level. So we have data centers in two key locations, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Denver, Colorado area. These are positioned to let us service all of the US and beyond. We have end users all over the world that are using services out of these data centers in private cloud. And so we can kind of leverage this geographic diversity to provide our disaster recovery capabilities. Both of those data centers, I won't go through the specs with them up there. You can see them for yourself. They're really kind of top tier facilities, and we think they represent some of the best out there. And we can sort of drill in a little bit more from there. If we look at availability that we can provide within the data center. And we have some technology advantages, I think, make our private cloud more resilient. So one of these we can look at as our go-to technology for disaster recovery, which is array-based replication, right? So we can do, or one could do replication at various levels, including hypervisor or application level replication or DR. But we start with array-based replication. This gives us the ability to offer really aggressive recovery points or RPOs by replicating at a block level. It's near zero impact to the running applications with super fast snap. Again, these are all flash systems typically doing this, so it's just imperceptible when we have to take these snaps and copies to move them, and it just uncomplicates the whole OS and application stack. So we're not interfering with the application delivery by protecting it. And what's super cool for our customers is we manage the whole thing. So our customers don't have to worry about making sure the bandwidth is available and fighting for that, buying dedicated circuits and keeping them sized right and watching SLA alarms, any of those kind of things. They don't have to deal with the network build out in between there and maintaining any of that. And this is what we use in both x86 and iSeries. So that does a really good job of tenant protection for us. And then if we kind of drill in even closer, we have VM protection. I think we talked about some of these things, right? But we have proactive, proactive hardware failure management. So that includes RAM. We have near zero DIMM failure crashes on that, right? If we have a memory failure, it generally doesn't take our customers' workloads out. We recognize it. That gets walled off before it is a problem. We move the VMs and we go and maintain the hardware node underneath them. The app just keeps running. No problem there. And that VM mobility, it's not just for those hardware type situations. That can be maintenance. That can be capacity moves. That can be, really all sorts of things. So we think that all these kind of technologies together really kind of go to that availability, both from a sort of a traditional DR perspective and that sort of that state preservation perspective that we talked about earlier.
So Josh, I have to ask this. Do you tuck your servers in at night?
I do, and I tell them a bedtime story too. But they don't.
I was going to say there's been talk, there's been some rumors, but
yeah, they never go to sleep though.
All right, so kind of going back to something we were talking about earlier, which is resiliency for enterprise apps. Let's get into a little bit more detail about the difference between modern applications and traditional apps. So just at a high level, modern apps gain resiliencies as you spread those soft dependencies apart. Traditional apps, though, gain resiliency as the hard dependencies are combined. So let's walk through a couple examples of what I mean by this. So first, we're going to start out with a modern app having soft dependencies. And then, so we're going to, the box that I'm showing there represents a physical piece of hardware. And each of the small squares inside it are basically servers or instances running. So we're assuming that this piece of physical hardware, the big box, fails once every 2 years. So this means that you've got a 50% chance of it failing within any given year. And all of those red boxes that are showing up there, that's the application that's running. So let's say this is a modern app and all 4 of those are running there. If that box dies, that app goes completely offline. So you got a 50% chance of that happening. Next slide. So as we go and we spread out those soft dependencies though, so now instead of all 4 of those being on one box, we're spreading them out across 3 boxes. So this is dramatically improving the resiliency because now all 3 boxes literally have to be down at the same time in order for that application to be offline. So there are no expected application outages happening due to a failure of a single individual host. Now let's contrast that with how things work with traditional enterprise apps. So instead of simply having the one server and having those dependencies on it, the more you spread that out across multiple servers, if any one of those servers goes down, basically your application goes down. So what you're wanting to do is really take all of those hard dependencies and collapse those to a single box if possible. So Frank, what would be an example of a hard dependency within JD Edwards?
Basically, your database instance or possibly the enterprise server would be a hard dependency. If you lose either one of those, it interrupts most, if not all, the users using web or batch.
Which kind of brings us full circle back to when we were talking about iSeries earlier. So literally you're taking your database, you're taking the enterprise, and in some cases you're even taking, I'm sorry, Frank, you're even taking WebSphere and running it all on the same box. So literally all of those dependencies are combined and thus increasing resiliency.
Yep, definitely.
So when thinking about database licensing options related to private cloud, Josh, can you give us some thoughts on what the overall landscape looks like? Should we be concerned about licensing database as opposed to public cloud?
Yeah, it's always very important to look at. This is one of the things that kind of impacts that decision quite significantly. The good news is that for most of our customers, we have licensing programs and our private cloud that look more familiar compared to their on-premise models. It tends to be more straightforward than trying to license the database in the public cloud. And really, let's face it, right? The top three public cloud players, at least in the JD Edwards space, and that's AWS, Microsoft, and Oracle. They're in a three-way fight with each other, among other providers out there too. Two of those providers showed up with the top two enterprise databases used by our JD Edwards customers. So these companies, they're weaponizing their database assets in their public cloud fight, and we've already seen the impacts to the customers. So with private cloud, one of the advantages of that is that it kind of keeps our customers out of the line of fire in that war in the public cloud arena being waged with those database licensing things that they're getting into. So again, it also tends to be less complicated too. So we think that's a potential advantage here on the private cloud side.
So Frank, I know a lot of our JD Edwards customers use Oracle Technology Foundation. Any licensing concerns for those customers with private cloud?
Nope. Basically a lot of in our private cloud itself, majority of the Oracle database customers are using the Tech Foundation, the Oracle Standard Edition 2. The other side of that, or again, they'll also use Microsoft SQL Server and some of them processor based. But the other one that has kind of a bundled, like a Tech Foundation, is the IBM I, or the AS400 includes the DB2 400. So you've got a couple of them there that work really well. And then again, we still have some nice advantages for the private cloud, even the licensing for the other scenarios.
Cool. Josh, Frank, thank you all so much for taking time today to share all this information with us. So just to recap some of the key takeaways. The first is, wow, these are all coming up in the wrong order. If we go back, Perfect. Thank you. So your ERP is like a pet, or your ERP is a pet. Treat it like one. And the ultimate pet is really the IBMI. And that's one of the things private cloud really excels at supporting, along with the supporting x86 workloads. As Josh said before, private cloud is very comparable with the public cloud options that are out there. And when it comes to processor-based licensing, private cloud may actually have an advantage. So definitely the first thing to look at when you're considering how you're going or what cloud you're going to deploy into is taking a look at what processor-based licensing you have. So this was the last in our Find Your Cloud series. And I just wanted to thank everybody for attending and hanging with us for these 4 sessions where we covered AWS, OCI, Azure, and now private cloud. If you'd like to have a conversation with us and really get into the nitty-gritty, gaming out the options on what is the best cloud for you, whether we're talking about JD Edwards or whether we're talking about other workloads, we'd really love an opportunity to work with you on this. Send us an email at findyourcloud@erpsuites.com. And on behalf of the entire ERP Suites team, thank you so much for attending.